here. Today I'm going to walk through a demonstration of how you might find a supported seat in a chair. The concept of sitting, the topic of sitting, comes up quite often in both my Rolfing practice and in my yoga teaching practice. A lot of us sit a lot of the time for a living, right? It's a part of many of our jobs. And we don't always know how we can create more options for ourselves in a seat. And of course, a seat is a really big part of this larger conversation of posture, right? Posture, I think in the modern context, meaning how we feel in our bodies at rest. Do we feel supported? Do we feel like we have the opportunity to rest while also feeling light and easeful? And so I'm going to walk through a couple of options today with a chair. So my chair has a firm seat. That's something that I like to help folks recognize. What's the quality of the material in the seat of your chair? Firmer chair material gives you more feedback, right? It may not feel like the cushiest, most luxurious thing, but I really like working with this, at least to start, because it helps us to invite our brains to feel what's happening with the pelvis. Because when we're in a seat, the pelvis is actually what we're tapping into gravity with. It's what we're tapping into something called the ground reaction force. The ground reaction force is always existing. You're always interacting with it. It's the concept that as gravity draws us down towards the earth itself is giving us some reaction force back, right? Because gravity has a vector, it's down, the ground reaction force is countering that vector. It's giving us a little bit of upright energy. And so in the seat, because the feet are no longer what's supporting us in gravity, the pelvis is the place where we're interacting with that ground reaction force. So it's important, at least in the way that I've been studying supported sitting, to build some awareness with the pelvis. How is your pelvis interacting with the ground reaction force? And because awareness is a huge part of the larger conversation about posture, I encourage you to start this practice working with a seat that has a firm seat itself. Okay, let's get into specifics. So I'm sitting here, I have found my seat. One of the things that you might have heard, or you may potentially be hearing for the first time here, is that it's helpful for your pelvis to be higher than your knees. There are multiple reasons for this. Even in a cross-legged seat on the floor, it's helpful for your pelvis to be lifted up higher than your knees. And a lot of that, again, has to do with the orientation of the pelvis. And a way that you can maybe gauge for yourself, doing a little mental exercise, if the pelvis is higher than the knees, is if you were to place a marble at the upper reaches of the tops, the fronts of the thighs, would the marble run down towards your knees? The answer for me in this chair is no. The seat of this chair is lower. Well, I should say the seat of this chair is too low for that marble to run down towards my knees. It's easy to fix. So I like to use yoga blocks. You could work with books. You could find a different chair if you have a similar issue. So I'm simply placing 2 blocks side by side on my chair. I could also work with 1 block because I know the width of my pelvis. I know that 1 block would work, but you might find that 2 blocks feels a little bit more supportive if you're playing along and you have all of these similar obstacles that I'm running into. Okay, now maybe you can even see that the trajectory of my thigh bones has changed. My pelvis is sitting just a little bit higher. It's slightly elevated compared to my knees. This is a good thing. We want this. Another aspect of finding a supported seat is to invite your heels to exist directly below the knees. So you're thinking about creating verticality in your shin bones that go straight up and down. I don't get too precise on this. The idea is that if you have your feet fully on the floor, you get to harness a little bit of that support, a little bit of the ground force from the feet as well. This is especially important if you're moving in your seat, right? But if you're just sitting at a table and working, bending the knees a little bit more, stretching them out, as long as the pelvis stays higher than the knees, you should be in good shape. Okay, so Now let's do the thing where we feel the pelvis. It can be really helpful. You saw me place my blocks forward on my seat, so they're towards the front edge of the seat. And if you don't have blocks, or you're working with a different kind of seat, maybe one that dips a little bit towards the back, scooting forward on your seat is going to be really helpful for this. The way we're going to feel the pelvis and become aware of the pelvis in our seat is by thinking about tucking the tail down and forward, and then doing the opposite, reaching the tail up and back. If you practice yoga, you might be familiar with a movement series of cat and cow. Keep doing this, by the way. Keep tucking the tail under and then reaching it back. If you're familiar with cat and cow, this movement is a lot like cat and cow, but you're just doing it at the pelvis. And when I say just doing it at the pelvis, really, there are other musculature and bony segments of yourself involved, right? The low spine is obviously impacted by the tilt of your pelvis. The space, the distance at the front of your hips is obviously impacted by the tilt of your pelvis. So keep doing this a couple of times and just feel what you feel. And see if you can feel the two bones at the base of your pelvis. They're called your ischial tuberosities. They're a really important bony structure for a lot of reasons. There are a lot of really important muscles that attach there. But in layman's terms, in more colloquial speak, your ischial tuberosities are actually called your sitz bones. Well, your sitz bones are your ischial tuberosities. Folks call them your sitz bones because, as far as we know from a biomechanical research-based perspective, our bodies are sort of designed to sit on these two bones. So pause your movement. If you didn't feel these two bones side to side, they're sort of framing the pelvic floor on your two sides. They're on the two lower ends of your pelvis. If you didn't feel those, we have a couple of options, because feeling your sitz bones is a really big part of this exercise. You can lift one side of your pelvis, use your hand and scoop some of your gluteal tissue out of the way and set your pelvis back down, and then do it to the other side as well. Hopefully, getting some of that tissue out of the way. Some of us have lots of volume in our pelvis area. That's wonderful. I am one of those people. Getting some tissue out of the way might really help your brain to clarify and feel some of that bone on your firm seat. And then you can tuck the tail and reach the tail back again. So if you're still not feeling your sitz bones, reach out to me. We can talk through it. We can kind of workshop it together, because that really is a big portion of any of this postural work. And then let's all start tucking and reaching again. So if you already had found your sit bones, start tucking and reaching again. And see if you can map the length of your sits bones. Your sits bones have length to them in the sense that there is some length, anterior, posterior length, front to back. They sit at a little bit of an angle. So if I was sitting in front of you, the back of the sits bones is a little bit wider than the front of the sits bones. That's fine. That would be a really refined inner felt sense if you could feel that. But what I want you to feel is more of that anterior, posterior length, that there's a front to back length to your sits bones, to your ischial tuberosities. So as you are tucking and reaching the tail back, notice if you're rolling onto the back part of your sits bones or the front part of your sits bones. Anterior means front, posterior means back. So as you tuck your tail, you're rolling onto the back, the posterior aspect of your sits bone. And as you reach the tail back, you're rolling onto the anterior, the front portion of your sits bone. So allow your brain to really map this and get a sense. Imagine that you're a cartographer, that you're a map maker, and with your mind's eye, map the length of your sits bones. And then see if you can settle in the middle. See if you can feel with your mind's eye where middle is and find yourself in the middle of your two sits bones. If you're going to err on one side, err on the side of shifting forward on the sits bones. So if you're not exactly sure where middle is, bias yourself a little bit towards the front, meaning bias yourself a little bit to the tail reaching back. Cool. Okay. So we've mapped these really important bony supportive structures of the pelvis. We've found our way to center on those bony structures. Allow the arms to be soft for a moment. Invite the tops of the shoulders to settle down and just see what it feels like to hang out here in space. This is probably already an improvement or a little bit more of an easeful seat that's not going to introduce quite so many disruptive factors to the rest of your skeletal system. So see if you can just settle here. See what it feels like to be perched on your sits bones. You could imagine their sits bones as like bird feet that you're perched on. Cool. So if you wanted to have one more resource here, one more opportunity to feel a shift in your relationship with gravity, a shift in your posture, it would be to feel again into the base of your pelvis, into your two sits bones. And imagine that you could grow roots out of the bottom of the sits bones into your supported seat, into the ground. And so with that imaginary feeling of growing roots down, could you imagine just ever so slightly increasing the contact between the pelvis and the earth? So you're increasing the contact, which also means that you're increasing the amount of ground reaction force that's coming into your body. So as you root down through the pelvis, keep the tops of the shoulders soft, and can you invite the crown of the head to float skyward? So you don't need to imagine somebody yanking on the top of the head, on the crown of the head. Just imagine maybe one of those like bobblehead fixtures, one of those bobblehead toys, and imagine that your bobblehead is settling and softening, and then it's just floating a little bit more skyward. So we're introducing this concept of bi-directional length to the spine, where the pelvis roots down, the crown of the head floats up, and the muscles and the stabilizing tonic muscles of your posture and your deep spine are getting an invitation through your nervous system, right? Through this imagination that you're cultivating of rooting down and floating up, your nervous system is inviting those stabilizing muscles to reorganize a little bit. So here you are, you're in a supported seat. Now, I want to say that I don't expect you to sit this way all the time. You should not expect yourself to sit this way all of the time. This is just an option. And right, there are many variations of this option. You could just take some time every day that you're in your seat to feel your pelvis. That's going to help your nervous system. That's going to help your body feel better from sitting during long periods of time. You could even, without working on the pelvis, imagine that bi-directional length, and that will give you an inner felt sense of a shift in these deep tonic muscles, these muscles that are so involved with your posture. Actually, I've been saying tonic, I mean phasic. I'll get into that in a different video. But these deep postural muscles that are really cultivated by how you're organized in gravity. And the best way that you can actually change your nervous system's interpretation of how you're organized in gravity is to feel into your body and imagine some new scenarios. Imagine your pelvis rooting down and the crown of the head floating up. And then some of these deep stabilizing muscles can adjust how they're toned, how they're thinking about supporting you in space. So these are great options. I have a client who is kind of a high level person in the organization that he works at, and he was being interviewed, and he's working with his supported seat, and his practice is simply, maybe once an hour he like checks in with how he's sitting and starts to find his way towards a supported seat, and inevitably that falls back into his more ingrained pattern. But he was being interviewed for like a piece, I guess, a video. And they had set up his frame for his video around his typical daily posture pattern. And because he's in such a practice right now of subconsciously tuning into where his body is regularly and finding a supported seat, the people filming him had to keep adjusting his frame because he got taller when he found his supported seat. And so that just goes to show that some of these really small movements, some of these really small shifts can have a really large impact. And I will also say that the benefits, the anatomical benefits that come from this way of sitting are what a lot of ergonomic chairs are trying to mimic. So I don't have anything against ergonomic chairs. If you're going to buy one, do plenty of research and make sure that you feel confident that the biomechanics of what's being introduced into your body feels correct to you. And if you ever want to chat about that, I can have a conversation with you. And just know that you have access to those same ways of sitting and potentially a more healthful, sustainable way of finding a supported seat because your body is doing it. Your nervous system is doing it. You're not just relying on the support of your chair. Both is a great solution. If you have an ergonomic chair that you can rely on when you get tired and when your brain doesn't have time to really think through this, great. And don't forget that you always have access to this type of a seat. Okay, that's it for the sitting tutorial. Thanks, friends.